Good evening and welcome to beautiful downtown San Antonio. This is the historic Sunset Depot train station here at the eastern edge of downtown San Antonio. And we are broadcasting not only live here in San Antonio tonight on News 4 San Antonio, but also on the web across the state through the help of our sister stations, because we are talking about a very important topic tonight, a town hall meeting all about your children and safety, guns and schools. Since Newtown, Connecticut and the shooting there have been a lot of changes in the law and some changes in classroom safety. In fact, in Texas, the Texas PTA says that before Newtown, there were 78 school districts that did not have adequate safety plans. Now, there are just 3. But what is the law and what isn't the law that some people may want it to be? Our Emily Baucom looks at that.
When you drive into Hunt, Texas, you see all the signs of a storybook. What you don't see are signs of crime. Of course, we didn't see those signs either in the small towns across America that became known for their school shootings.
I've been through a school shooting, holding a student's legs while he bled.
That was 20 years ago in Amarillo when Dr. Crystal Dockery taught at a large high school and a student opened fire.
Though we did not lose any children that day, 6 students were shot.
She has a much different job now as superintendent of the Hunt District. Fewer than 200 kids roam these hallways, and it would take 20 minutes for the closest sheriff's office to get here. That's why this district decided to arm its teachers.
We would have a designee or designees that are chosen by the school board and approved by me.
Those teachers will have concealed handgun licenses, plus rigorous hostage training and a psychological evaluation. Dr. Dockery says no one in the small town will know which teachers are carrying guns.
What Newtown did was it made the argument, it can't happen here, completely invalid.
Barbara Beto is with the Texas PTA. Since Newtown, she's helped lawmakers in Austin develop school safety guidelines. Having guns in the classroom is still a district decision.
We are in favor of that decision being made locally. We would not come into a small district and say, don't arm your teachers because it's not good, because the other option may be nothing, and that's not good either.
Lawmakers did provide extra training opportunities for teachers who take arms, and schools can now designate an armed marshal on campus. But the Texas PTA says when it comes to keeping schools safe, guns are not a silver bullet.
They always come to us and they say, Barbara, if we're talking about the guns, it's too late. There's so much on the front end that we need to be doing.
Schools across Texas are placing new emphasis on anti-bullying programs. And in Hunt, new fencing and video cameras will be in place by the start of the new school year.
It's not about us going out and being a vigilante. It's about, do we have someone who could respond in our area if we needed them?
So even in a place where crime seems so far away, the community is prepared. Emily Baucom, News 4, San Antonio.
Now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for the evening, the Vice President of the Sinclair Broadcast Group, Mark Hyman. Mark?
Welcome to Sunset Station in downtown San Antonio. Good evening, I'm Mark Hyman, host of Behind the Headlines and the moderator of the Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall series. Tonight's topic, guns on campus. It's controversial, it's passionate, it's emotional. It's been in the headlines for months now. It's an issue that people want to discuss, debate, question, and of course get answers. Now we've got an energized audience right here at Sunset Station who have questions they want to put to our panel of experts. But they're not the only ones who can participate. Those of you watching us at home can also be a part of this discussion. News 4 reporter Michael Garofalo is manning our social media desk. He will explain how you too could participate. Michael?
Thank you, Mark. Our viewers can connect with us via Facebook at facebook.com/News4SA. Once again, facebook.com/News4SA, and also via Twitter at News4SA and hashtag Your Voice, Your Future. Already got a lot of comments, a lot of questions, Mark. You'll be hearing them soon.
Thanks, Michael. And of course, get your questions in because one of the questions I ask live on air may be yours. Now, I mentioned we have an audience ready to ask a lot of questions. They're going to put those to our panel of experts. And we've assembled a terrific panel of experts, so let's go ahead and meet them. Joining us tonight is Dr. Brian Woods. He's the superintendent of the Northside Independent School District. Ed Garza, he's board president of the San Antonio Independent School District. Larry Arnold, he's with Texas Concealed Handgun Association. And Josh Felker, he's owner of Lone Star Handguns. I'd I'd like to point out that our panel members are here in their personal capacities. The views they represent are their own unless they tell us otherwise. Any additional biographical information about them or their organizations can be found on our website, news4sa.com. Now, we're going to start the evening off by asking the first question, not of our panel members, but of our studio audience. I'd like to ask you to respond by the sound of applause to a question, and your two choices and answers are yes and no. My first snap poll question of the evening: is there anything that could have absolutely prevented the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School or similar shooting events? Those who believe yes, please applaud. And those who believe no, please applaud. Okay, now I want to put the same question to our panel members by a show of hands. Is there anything that could have absolutely prevented the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School last year? If you believe yes, please raise your hand. If you believe no, please raise your hand. So it's interesting, we have a bit of a split here because our audience thought there was something could be done, and our panel members are unanimous and believe that nothing could be done. All right, let's go to our first audience member question of the evening. Please join me back here for a moment. Step on back here. Step right over here. Please tell us who you are, where you're from, and ask your question.
My name's Kristen Benavides, and I live in Bernie. There are lots of products that are available, such as whiteboards that have bulletproof material or backpack inserts. There's even a chair that has a bulletproof vest built in. My question is, what types of protective measures are being taken to protect staff and students, and what funds are available to pay for those products?
Brian?
There really are three methods to protect staff and students and parents who come to campus, and that's procedures, which are incredibly important, human resources, which frequently comes in the form of police officers, and then finally technology, and you mentioned some of those types of items. And so there's a world of answers to that particular question. To get to your question about funding, the answer is that's locally taxpayer funded. Frankly, there is no other funding source to do those kinds of things, and so schools make those choices locally about what they can and are willing to do.
So, Josh, is that enough? I mean, what Brian's addressed, is that going to take care of the problems we're plagued with, or are there other solutions that perhaps should be examined?
I don't believe we can ever solve all the problems. We can't stop human evil, we can't stop people, but we can take some preventative measures, and those are very good measures. It a lot of times comes down to funding, and to me it also comes down to taking personal responsibility as an individual and as a society too, trying to prevent these crazies from performing those acts. And that's the one thing I don't think any of us can ever stop, and that's why I raised my hand. I'm a pro-gun guy, but there's absolutely nothing other than the end of times that would have stopped or 100% stopped it. There's things that could have prevented it or helped slow it down, but you can't stop a determined individual. You can just slow him down.
Thank you. I'm going to actually surprise one of my audience members. I'm going to ask Dr. Eisenberg to please join me up here for a moment. And Doctor, come on up here. And I actually want to read something. It was a great article in USA Today newspaper a few months ago. And I want to read this part first, and I'd like to put a question to you. And I'm going to read part of the article. It's referring to the shootings that have taken place, mass shootings in theaters and schools and so forth. This is the part I want to address. We respond by blaming guns, our inattentiveness to mental health, violence in the media or video games, or family values. Yes, all are players, but our daughters are able to find the same guns in the same homes, are about as likely to be mentally ill, have the same family values, and are exposed to the same violence in the media. Our daughters, however, do not kill. Why the difference? So when we talk about school shootings, we often see young males, teens through 20s. Do you have a sense as to why it's an issue with boys and not so much with girls when they have the same kind of relations and stimuli and so forth, exposure to the media?
Well, I think it's clear that boys respond more intensely, are more attracted to violence. Exactly why? I mean, you know, there's tons of people who think it has either to do with somewhat with socialization, that we emphasize that boys have to be tough. But I do think there is an element to which it goes to biology, that for whatever reason, boys are more attracted to violence. We know that boys will be more attracted to aggressive TV programming. Girls just they're not as exposed to it because they don't find it as interesting. Do I think that TV makes kids go out and shoot up schools? Absolutely not, because
Thankfully.
I don't think you'll find a young man in this culture who hasn't watched hours of violence on TV. It's clearly more than just the exposure to violence.
And thank you for taking care of us TV people, by the way. No, stay here just for a moment. So, Ed, should there be different attention focused on boys in schools, particularly those teen boys? Are they really the real threat? And should we look at them differently than we do girls?
Well, I don't think we can necessarily take for granted the trend in terms of gender preferences towards aggression or violence. I think we can find cases on both sides. As a school district or as a policymaker, we really have to look at it in terms of the situation in our community and how to respond to the needs that exist in our community based on incidents, based on issues that arise. We would turn to our law enforcement experts to provide us that kind of information and data. In a school district, we have a police chief, we have a police force. We also utilize the resources locally with our police department, with our sheriff department. So we would rely on the expertise in providing us data as well on the safety plan and safety measures that we should put in place, not necessarily gender specific, but applicable to our entire community.
Larry, regarding what Ed just said, does it make sense? Should we focus perhaps more so on any specific threat area? The profile, it's not a word that's held in high regard, but is it legitimate to maybe profile certain kinds of personalities? I know you're not a doctor, we've got one right here, but as someone who's looking at the issue of guns.
Well, I do have a degree in sociology. I've worked a lot with survivors of sexual assault and other violence as one of my other careers. One of the things I've noticed when you talk about boys are more violent than girls, or boys are more competitive than girls, or any of those, you have the bell curve. Yes, if you look at the bell curve for competitive, the boys go like this and the girls go like this. But when you get down on this end and you've got an Olympic shooter, she's going to be competitive and just as competitive as the boys. So I think there's more variation as far as being competitive or violent outside of the sexes than there is if you're looking within the sexes. You really can't look particularly at these isolated incidents by looking at averages.
By the way, I want to thank Dr. Eisenberg, but if you have something to add on this,
well,
please.
I just say, that these young men that we're talking about who commit these extreme acts of violence are outliers for sure. When you look at the numbers of them, to say we need to, profile or look at young men, we're talking a teeny, tiny percentage. Clearly they can do huge damage, but there aren't that many of them, and we're not going to find them that easily because there are so few of them.
And I'd like to thank Dr. Eisenberg. We may rely on you more throughout the evening talking about behavior and mental health, and she's joining us from UT San Antonio. All right, let's talk about boys and behavior, and even girls in behavior at school. I'm actually going to go to another audience member, and then after that I'm going to get to our social media, but I'm going to ask the sheriff to join us for a moment. Sheriff, if you could stand up here, just tell us who you are, and then we'll talk about my question of you.
I'm Susan Powerlow, and I'm the sheriff of Bexar County.
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us. Now, the question I want to put, and I know this is the larger issue of law enforcement in schools, and they go by different names all around the country, school marshals, resource officers, but can you talk, at least in general terms, of what we understand to be the value of having a law enforcement officer in a school, whether it's a school officer, whether it's the local community? What does that mean? Where are the shortfalls, perhaps, and what can we do to improve the process?
I think there's an important aspect in terms of young people getting accustomed to law enforcement as their friends and someone they can go to for help. It's also there as a matter of protection when things happen across the school or when an emergency occurs, that they are there to be able to respond to those things that happen in those environments. I think here in San Antonio and Bexar County, we are fortunate that we've got very large school districts that have police forces, that have the capability to, provide these kinds of services. The law that was just passed in the Texas legislature extends that, and mostly it's helpful to small cities, small school districts, smaller schools, so that they can hire the kind of resources that are trained to do these kinds of things. But I don't want to leave any delusions with anybody, is that the amount of training that someone would get being a school marshal, if they already don't have law enforcement experience, is pretty limited. I'm a CHL carrier. I was before I became the sheriff. And that's really basic training for handling a weapon and basic care of a weapon. As a law enforcement officer, and I've already been through the weapons training for law enforcement officer, that's much more extensive. And for a certified peace officer, there's an extensive amount of training to deal with active shooter circumstances, dealing with situations that we've talked about in terms of Sandy Hook. So there's a big difference in terms of the level of training, but it also goes to the training, but also the partnership with educators, processes, procedures that are set in place. So from evacuations to being in a safe place, all those kinds of things combined with first responder, law enforcement capability, that all goes together to make sure that we have a good plan and that we can protect children in our schools.
Brian, you're a superintendent of Northside Independent School District. Are you comfortable with the level of presence you have by law enforcement in your schools, or are there some shortfalls that perhaps you need to shore up with law enforcement?
You know, I think that you could always look at expanding that presence. There's a balance to be had, and I think that the sheriff touched on it, between having enough law enforcement and yet providing folks with a rather limited amount of training, and then asking them to do essentially what you would ask a law enforcement officer to do. In our school district, we have police officers on all of our secondary campuses, and we're in the process of augmenting the portion of our police officers that serves our elementary campuses. And so we're doing just what you mentioned in our school district now.
What about middle schools? Is that a different kettle of fish, or are there issues at the middle school?
No, we have a police officer permanently assigned to all of our middle schools.
Josh, does that solve the problem then?
I think it falls into layers of security. You got to have multiple layers of security, and I agree, CHL is a very low level of understanding, but I also know that most active shooters are going for the path of least resistance, the less likely to find somebody with a firearm, because if you're crazy and wanting to get across your agenda and live in fantasy land, you're going to go to the place where it's less likely that there will be somebody with a firearm for your armed resistance. So having multiple layers of security, law enforcement is a great layer of security, and the personal responsibility, like I was going back to again. I think the ability for a teacher to be able to lawfully, legally carry in a school is a good thing. And no one's asking a teacher to be a peace officer. The martial law gives them arrest authority within that statute as long as they're doing so to protect somebody and such. But the same thing I ask my teachers to be able to protect my kids from a bully, to stop them from being bullied, I also would like the teacher to have the ability, not requirement, but the ability to stop or give a fighting chance to an active shooter. And I think that's one of those additional layers.
Now, Sheriff, just in the interest of our audience, any chance you can fix any parking tickets or traffic violations for anyone here tonight?
You know, I'm a really fair and equitable person, and I'll treat you just like all the rest of the criminals.
I'm sorry, audience. I tried my best to take care of everyone tonight. Thank you, Sheriff.
You know, I would say Chief Bill McManus and I work very closely together, and he and I talked this afternoon, and he sent his regrets that he wasn't able to be here. But I know that he has had a very active role in supporting all of the independent school districts here in San Antonio and Bexar County. We have directed patrol officers. In fact, one of my officers who is here tonight who has that responsibility. And we are also enhancing our capability to support school systems in the unincorporated areas, and so share that partnership with educators and with other law enforcement in this community.
Great. Thank you very much, Sheriff.
Yeah.
I know we have a lot of folks who want to be a part of this discussion, not only here at Sunset Station, but also at home. So we're going to go to our social media desk. Michael, what do you have for us?
Mark, trending right now, I basically have if teachers are allowed to carry guns in schools, how do you make sure those guns stay safe? And I have two questions I'm going to read from our audience, online that is, of course, where Bruce says, we keep hearing about children getting hold of a gun in their homes and shooting themselves or their family. What measures will be in place to prevent children from getting a hold of these guns once they are in a school? And Elizabeth says, what if a teacher gets strong-armed by a tough kid and then the student has the gun?
Larry, isn't that a concern that perhaps guns can't be secured properly by faculty and staff who have them in schools?
If you have children attacking your teachers, you've got a problem way beyond what we're talking about here tonight. So I would address that first. I've been carrying for 16 years, every time since we've had it here in Texas. And you carry, you're responsible for it, you take care of it. As long as it's on your person, you know where it is, you know who has access to it. And if it's not on your person, you lock it up. So carrying a gun as a civilian, as a CHL, is really no different than carrying it as a law enforcement officer, other than most people don't know we have them, and the law enforcement officers typically carry those out in the open.
Ed, do you agree?
Well, I think when you look at the school districts and schools across Texas and America, when we talk about law enforcement in the schools, police officers, school district officers, traditionally or historically, they've been brought in to provide protection within, meaning student situations with teachers at the high school level, somewhat at the middle school level. There was less of a demand or need to protect the school from outside factors. I think the whole discussion here today is a focus of external factors that may impact the safety of kids based on what happened in Sandy Hook. My philosophy is really that we really need to go back to allowing local school districts, independent school districts, the control and the ability to make that determination if the need is there. And if a school district adopts a policy that allows teachers to that are licensed to carry a concealed locked weapon, the public needs to understand there are potential consequences and risks associated with accidental shootings, guns that are not secured properly, in the wrong hands, teachers that may be upset at each other. The education world, as Dr. Woods can articulate, teachers have much more responsibility today than ever in terms of standardized testing, discipline, parent issues, curriculum. Having a gun in the classroom is another added responsibility that is already on a big plate of responsibilities for teachers. The role is not the same as it has been in the past, and I think most teachers, at least from our community, would rather have a law enforcement officer whose sole responsibility for the day is to protect students and teachers and guests that may be on that campus, not a teacher that has another 100 responsibilities.
This is where I'm going to ask my second snap poll question of the evening, and your response by a sound of applause is, the choices are yes or no. My question: does popular culture contribute to violent events such as school shootings? Those who believe yes, please applaud. Those who believe no, please applaud. Okay, we're going to go back to the audience for another question, and we probably won't get through the entire answer because we're going to have to make a little change here on our broadcast. But let me get to you, sir. Please tell us who you are, where you're from, and ask your question.
George Rodriguez from San Antonio. And my question is, do you feel that the schools have now become surrogate parents, and therefore there's no proper upbringing and respect of life, particularly of guns, in the schools? I just don't. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, we never heard of a shooting in a school. We never heard of that kind of violence. And now, you know, I remember when Kennedy was killed, there was no one that came to talk to us as far as counseling and that kind of life. I mean, where does the family begin? Where does the home environment start about bringing up a person, particularly as far as violence, and where does it end?
Brian?
That's probably a bigger question than we have time to answer. Clearly society's changed over time, and I think there is a general societal expectation that schools do more than they did in the time periods that you mentioned. That's part of our reality, and I don't know that I'm equipped to answer your question about where the family should begin and end. But I agree with your point that there does seem to be more responsibility expected of the schools.
And Brian, I'm going to interrupt you just for a moment because I have to take care of some television business here. Those of you watching us live on News 4, we're going to have to break from our live broadcast to go to our primetime programming. You can continue watching us on news4sa.com, and of course all of our sister stations continue watching on your webcast. So watch the program online. We're still running the event, but we're going to have to go back to our primetime programming on News 4. Thank you for joining us there. Now let's go back to a rebuttal from Josh.
I do believe school shootings aren't a new thing. This is something that's been going on for the latter part of the century. It really is just as media and our awareness happens and the focus that continues even days, months, and weeks afterwards, it's there. I do believe that as a society we rely on more and more on somebody else to raise our children and getting rid of personal responsibility. Do I believe that violence and a violent culture is somewhat contributing? That's a tough one. Dave Grossman did some really good studies on this about violent video games and what it does and doesn't do to a person. I'm not saying playing a violent video game, playing Call of Duty is going to make you an active shooter the next day, but if you have that tendency, possibly more so. And I'm a guy that, heck, I've done some things, been some places. I have, as a father, have reduced my boys' time to play violent video games. I've made that decision that this may not be the best thing for them to do because they're young, maturing minds. Does that mean if they were to continue doing that, or if your kids were to continue doing that, they're going to be active shooters? No. But if they have that tendency and all that, could that lead to it? Yeah, there's been a lot of the active shooters have been shown that days prior or hours prior, they were actually playing violent video games. And I'm all about playing Call of Duty, but I do think that as a society we've gone down a path where we're expecting these gentlemen and their teachers to do everything for us and hold them ultimately responsible. And back to Mr. Garza's statement, teachers do have a very difficult job. I really believe they do. And like I mentioned, I'm not telling a teacher that they need to carry a firearm. If the teacher feels that they are responsible enough that they could do so and control it, I think that should be, as an adult, an option that they have the ability to exercise. Not just to protect my kids or your kids, but to also to protect themselves.
Larry, I believe you wanted to weigh in on this?
I got the most gray hair here. I remember back when I was 8 years old, I got to be a Cub Scout, and we wore our Cub Scout uniforms to school, and I carried my Cub Scout pocket knife in the 3rd grade. When I graduated from Edison High School in 1965, virtually every high school in New York City had a rifle team. Kids would get up in the morning, carry their rifle to school on the subway, and nobody'd pay them any more attention than they did the kid with the trombone case. We've taken away a lot of that responsibility. How are our students going to grow up and learn responsibility if we don't trust them with responsibility? We're hearing stories of young ladies who are seniors in high school who aren't allowed to carry their Advil. When are they going to learn to be responsible?
Ed, is there a balance? I mean, certainly it isn't 1965 with all due respect, and I don't mean that in a sarcastic way, but is there a balance perhaps that in today's day and age where we can at least allow children to have certain amounts so they can bring their Advil to school, we can trust them with a pocket knife?
Well, there certainly is, and again, I think a rural situation may be different from an urban situation or a suburban situation, and the size of the school district and how they identify policies and procedures may vary. However, my wife is a public school teacher, and I've seen her change coming home in the last 20 years. I had been away from the public school system When I was elected to the board in 2009 and returned to the high school that I graduated from and the middle school and those schools, I was in shock. It was a different era. It's a different culture. But as I have served, I have learned to appreciate that it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that times are different and you have to be able to adjust to the society that we're living in, or else we cannot do our job as a school. If we say we're not going to teach John and Mary because they don't have parents that give them discipline at home, then we are failing those students. And it's not their fault that they don't have parents at home that care about them, but they are now on our campus, and we have to figure out the best way, the most creative way to provide an education, because we, the school district, will be held accountable. Based on the state of Texas and the state laws, we will be held accountable if that student is referred as a disciplinary problem, if they're expelled, if they drop out, and only the kids that have structure remain in school. Guess what? That school gets penalized. It gets a bad rating. The school district gets a bad rating. So we're held to not have excuses, no matter what situation students come with. And that's where I think we have to be flexible, and we have to design our schools around the societies and the communities that we serve.